Chapter 30, Part 1 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Adams. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2, Paris and Prison, by Giacomo Casanova. Translated by Arthur Machen. Episode 10, Chapter 30, Part 1. The escape. I nearly lose my life on the roof. I get out of the ducal palace, take a boat, and reach the mainland. Danger to which I am exposed by Father Balbi. My scheme for ridding myself of him. I got out the first, and Father Balbi followed me. Soradaci, who had come as far as the opening, had orders to put the plate of lead back in its place, and then to go and pray to St. Francis for us. Keeping on my hands and knees, and grasping my pike firmly, I pushed it obliquely between the joining of the plates of lead, and then, holding the side of the plate which I had lifted, I succeeded in drawing myself up to the summit of the roof. The monk had taken hold of my waistband to follow me, and thus I was like a beast of burden who has to carry and draw along at the same time, and this on a steep and slippery roof. When we were half-way up, the monk asked me to stop, as one of his packets had slipped off, and he hoped it had not gone further than the gutter. My first thought was to give him a kick and to send him after his packet, but, praise be to God, I had sufficient self-control not to yield to it. And indeed the punishment would have been too heavy for both of us, as I should have had no chance of escaping by myself. I asked him if it were the bundle of rope, and on his replying that it was a small packet of his own, containing manuscript he had found in one of the garrets under the leads, I told him he must bear it patiently, as a single step might be our destruction. The poor monk gave a sigh, and, he still clinging to my waist, we continued climbing. After having surmounted with the greatest difficulty 15 or 16 plates, we got to the top, on which I sat astride, Father Balbi imitating my example. Our backs were towards the little island of St. George the Greater, and about 200 paces in front of us were the numerous cupolas of St. Mark's Church, which forms part of the ducal palace, for St. Mark's is really the Doge's private chapel, and no monarch in the world can boast of having a finer. My first step was to take off my bundle, and I told my companion to do the same. He put the rope as best he could upon his thighs, but, wishing to take off his hat, which was in his way, he took hold of it awkwardly, and it was soon dancing from plate to join the packet of linen in the gutter. My poor companion was in despair. "A bad omen," he exclaimed. "Our task has but begun, and here I am deprived of shirt, hat, and a precious manuscript, containing a curious account of the festivals of the palace." I felt calmer now that I was no longer crawling on hands and knees, and I told him quietly that the two accidents which had happened to him had nothing extraordinary in them, and that not even a superstitious person would call them omens, that I did not consider them in that light, and that they were far from damping my spirits. "They ought rather," said I, "to warn you to be prudent, and to remind you that God is certainly watching over us. For if your hat had fallen to the left instead of to the right, we should have been undone, as in that case it would have fallen into the palace court, where it would have caught the attention of the guards, and have let them know that there was someone on the roof, and in a few minutes we should have been retaken." After looking about me for some time, I told the monk to stay still till I came back, and I set out, my pike in my hand, sitting astride the roof and moving along without any difficulty. For nearly an hour I went to this side and that, keeping a sharp look-out, but in vain, for I could see nothing to which the rope could be fastened, and I was in the greatest perplexity as to what was to be done. It was of no use thinking of getting down on the canal side, or by the court of the palace, and the church offered only precipices which led to nothing. To get to the other side of the church towards the Canonica, I should have had to climb roofs so steep that I saw no prospect of success. The situation called for hardihood, but not the smallest piece of rashness. It was necessary, however, either to escape or to re-enter the prison, perhaps never again to leave it, or to throw myself into the canal. In such a dilemma it was necessary to leave a good deal to chance and to make a start of some kind. My eye caught a window on the canal sides, and 2/3 of the distance from the gutter to the summit of the roof. It was a good distance from the spot I had set out from, so I concluded that the garret lighted by it did not form part of the prison I had just broken. It could only light a loft, inhabited or uninhabited, above some rooms in the palace, the doors of which would probably be opened by daybreak. I was morally sure that if the palace servants saw us they would help us to escape, and not deliver us over to the inquisitors, even if they recognized us as criminals of the deepest dye, so heartily was the State Inquisition hated by everyone. It was thus necessary for me to get in front of the window, and letting myself slide softly down in a straight line, I soon found myself astride on top of the dormer roof. Then, grasping the sides, I stretched my head over, and succeeded in seeing and touching a small grating, behind which was a window of square panes of glass joined with thin strips of lead. I did not trouble myself about the window, but the grating, small as it was, appeared an insurmountable difficulty, failing a file, and I had only my pike. I was thoroughly perplexed, and was beginning to lose courage, when an incident of the simplest and most natural kind came to my aid and fortified my resolution. Philosophic reader, if you will place yourself for a moment in my position, if you will share the sufferings which for 15 months had been my lot, if you think of my danger on the top of a roof, where the slightest step in a wrong direction would have cost me my life, if you consider the few hours at my disposal to overcome difficulties which might spring up at any moment, the candid confession I am about to make will not lower me in your esteem. At any rate, if you do not forget that a man in an anxious and dangerous position is in reality only half himself. It was the clock of St. Mark's striking midnight, which, by a violent shock, drew me out of the state of perplexity I had fallen into. The clock reminded me that the day just beginning was All Saints' Day, the day of my patron saint, at least if I had one, and the prophecy of my confessor came into my mind. But I confess that what chiefly strengthened me, both bodily and mentally, was the profane oracle of my beloved Ariosto, fra il fin d'ottobre a il capo di novembre. The chime seemed to me a speaking talisman, commanding me to be up and doing, and promising me the victory. Lying on my belly, I stretched my head towards the grating, and pushing my pike into the sash which held it, I resolved to take it out in a piece. In a quarter of an hour I succeeded, and held the whole grate in my hands, and putting it on one side I easily broke the glass window, though wounding my left hand. With the aid of my pike, using it as I had done before, I regained the ridge of the roof, and went back to the spot where I had left Balbi. I found him enraged and despairing, and he abused me heartily for having left him for so long. He assured me that he was only waiting for it to get light to return to the prison. What did you think had become of me? I thought you must have fallen over. And you can find no better way than abuse to express the joy you ought to feel at seeing me again? What have you been doing all this time? Follow me, and you shall see. I took up my packets again and made my way toward the window. As soon as we were opposite to it I told Balbi what I had done, and asked him if he could think of any way of getting into the loft. For one, it was easy enough, for the other could lower him by the rope, but I could not discover how the second of us was to get down afterwards, as there was nothing to which the rope could be fastened. If I let myself fall I might break my arms and legs, for I did not know the distance between the window and the floor of the room. To this chain of reasoning, uttered in the friendliest possible tone, the brute replied thus: "You let me down, and when I have got to the bottom you will have plenty of time to think how you are going to follow me." I confess that my first indignant impulse was to drive my pike into his throat. My good genius stayed my arm, and I uttered not a word in reproach of his base selfishness. On the contrary, I straightway untied my bundle of rope and bound him strongly under the elbows, and making him lie flat down, I lowered him feet foremost on to the roof of the dormer window. When he got there I told him to lower himself into the window as far as his hips, supporting himself by holding his elbows against the sides of the window. As soon as he had done so I slid down the roof as before, and lying down on the dormer roof with a firm grasp of the rope, I told the monk not to be afraid but to let himself go. When he reached the floor of the loft he untied himself, and on drawing the rope back I found the fall was one of 50 feet, too dangerous a jump to be risked. The monk, who for 2 hours had been a prey to terror, seated in a position which I confess was not a very reassuring one, was not quite cool, and called out to me to throw him the ropes for him to take care of, a piece of advice you may be sure I took care not to follow. Not knowing what to do next, and waiting for some fortunate idea, I made my way back to the ridge of the roof, and from there spied out a corner near a cupola, which I had not visited. I went towards it and found a flat roof with a large window closed with 2 shutters. At hand was a tub full of plaster, a trowel, and ladder which I thought long enough for my purpose. This was enough, and tying my rope to the first round, I dragged this troublesome burden after me to the window. My next task was to get the end of the ladder, which was 12 fathoms long, into the opening, and the difficulties I encountered made me sorry that I had deprived myself of the aid of the monk. Here's an editor note. The unit of measure fathoms describing the ladder, and earlier the 100 fathoms of rope, is likely a translation error. Casanova might have manufactured 100 feet of rope, and might have dragged a 12-foot ladder up the steep roof, but not a longer. D.W. I had set the ladder in such a way that one end touched the window, and the other went below the gutter. I next slid down to the roof of the window, and drawing the ladder towards me, I fastened the end of my rope to the 8th round, and then let it go again till it was parallel with the window. I then strove to get it in, but I could not insert it farther than the 5th round, for the end of the ladder being stopped by the inside roof of the window, no force on earth could have pushed it any further without breaking either the ladder or the ceiling. There was nothing to be done but to lift it by the other end. It would then slip down by its own weight. I might, it is true, have placed the ladder across the window, and have fastened the rope to it, in which manner I might have let myself down into the loft without any risk, but the ladder would have been left outside to show Lawrence and the guards where to look for us, and possibly to find us in the morning. I did not care to risk by a piece of imprudence the fruit of so much toil and danger, and to destroy all traces of our whereabouts the ladder must be drawn in. Having no one to give me a helping hand, I resolved to go myself to the parapet to lift the ladder and attain the end I had in view. I did so, but at such a hazard as it almost cost me my life. I could let go the ladder while I slackened the rope without any fear of it falling over, as it had caught to the parapet by the 3rd rung. Then, my pike in my hand, I slid down beside the ladder to the parapet, which held up the points of my feet, as I was lying on my belly. In this position I pushed the ladder forward, and was able to get it into the window to the length of a foot, and that diminished by a good deal its weight. I now only had to push it in another 2 feet, as I was sure that I could get it in altogether by means of the rope from the roof of the window. To impel the ladder to the extent required I got on my knees, but the effort I had to use made me slip, and in an instant I was over the parapet as far as my chest, sustained by my elbows. I shudder still when I think of this awful moment, which cannot be conceived in all its horror. My natural instinct made me almost unconsciously strain every nerve to regain the parapet, and, I had nearly said miraculously, I succeeded. Taking care not to let myself slip back an inch, I struggled upwards with my hands and arms, while my belly was resting on the edge of the parapet. Fortunately the ladder was safe, for with that unlucky effort which had nearly cost me so dearly, I had pushed it in more than 3 feet, and there it remained. Finding myself resting on my groin on the parapet, I saw that I had only to lift up my right leg, and to put up first one knee and then the other, to be absolutely out of danger. But I had not yet got to the end of my trouble. The effort I made gave me so severe a spasm that I became cramped and unable to use my limbs. However, I did not lose my head, but kept quiet till the pain had gone off, knowing by experience that keeping still is the best cure for the false cramp. It was a dreadful moment. In 2 minutes I made another effort, and had the good fortune to get my 2 knees onto the parapet, and as soon as I had taken breath I cautiously hoisted the ladder and pushed it half-way through the window. I then took my pike, and crawling up as I had done before, I reached the window, where my knowledge of the laws of equilibrium and leverage aided me to insert the ladder to its full length, my companion receiving the end of it. I then threw into the loft the bundles and the fragments that I had broken off the window, and I stepped down to the monk, who welcomed me heartily and drew in the ladder. Arm in arm we proceeded to inspect the gloomy retreat in which we found ourselves, and judged it to be about 30 paces long by 20 wide. At one end were folding doors barred with iron. This looked bad, but putting my hand to the latch in the middle it yielded to the pressure, and the door opened. The first thing we did was to make the tour of the room, and crossing it we stumbled against a large table surrounded by stools and armchairs. Returning to the part where we had seen windows, we opened the shutters of one of them, and the light of the stars only showed us the cupolas and the depths beneath them. I did not think for a moment of lowering myself down, as I wished to know where I was going, and I did not recognize our surroundings. I shut the window up, and we returned to the place where we had left our packages. Quite exhausted, I let myself fall on the floor, and placing a bundle of rope under my head, a sweet sleep came to me. Relief. I abandoned myself to it without resistance, and indeed I believe if death were to have been the result, I should have slept all the same, and I still remember how I enjoyed that sleep. It lasted for 3½ hours, and I was awakened by the monks calling out and shaking me. He told me that it had just struck 5. He said it was inconceivable to him how I could sleep in the situation we were in. But that which was inconceivable to him was not so to me. I had not fallen asleep on purpose, but had only yielded to the demands of exhausted nature, and, if I may say so, to the extremity of my need. In my exhaustion there was nothing to wonder at, since I had neither eaten nor slept for 2 days, and the efforts I had made, efforts almost beyond the limits of mortal endurance, might well have exhausted any man. In my sleep my activity had come back to me, and I was delighted to see the darkness disappearing, so that we should be able to proceed with more certainty and quickness. Casting a rapid glance around, I said to myself, "This is not a prison, there ought, therefore, be some easy exit from it." We addressed ourselves to the end opposite to the folding doors, and in a narrow recess I thought I made out a doorway. I felt it over and touched a lock, into which I thrust my pike and opened it with 3 or 4 heaves. We then found ourselves in a small room, and I discovered a key on a table, which I tried on a door opposite to us, which, however, proved to be unlocked. I told the monk to go for our bundles, and replacing the key, we passed out and came into a gallery containing presses full of papers. They were the state archives. I came across a short flight of stone stairs, which I descended, then another, which I descended also, and found a glass door at the end, on opening which I entered a hall well known to me. We were in the ducal chancery. I opened a window and could have got down easily, but the result would have been that we should have been trapped in the maze of little courts around St. Mark's Church. I saw on a desk an iron instrument, of which I took possession. It had a rounded point and a wooden handle, being used by the clerks of the chancery to pierce parchments for the purpose of affixing the leaden seals. On opening the desk I saw the copy of a letter advising the Proveditore of Corfu of a grant of 3,000 sequins for the restoration of the old fortress. I searched for the sequins, but they were not there. God knows how gladly I would have taken them, and how I would have laughed the monk to scorn if he had accused me of theft. I should have received the money as a gift from heaven, and should have regarded myself as its master by conquest. Going to the door of the chancery, I put my bar in the keyhole, but finding immediately that I could not break it open, I resolved on making a hole in the door. I took care to choose the side where the wood had fewest knots, and working with all speed, I struck as hard and as cleaving strokes as I was able. The monk, who helped me as well as he could with the punch I had taken from the desk, trembled at the echoing clamour of my pike, which must have been audible at some distance. I felt the danger myself, but it had to be risked. End of chapter 30, part 1. Recording by Paul Adams. www.yawnguy.com